Good evening, friends, and thank you for being here. Thank you for your support for the museum. It's my pleasure to introduce Tristram Hunt, who is the director of one of the great museums of the world, the Victorian Albert Museum. That is, of course, a sister museum of ours. There's a kind of umbilical link between the two institutions, which I think Tristram is going to touch on as well. Tristram has a very interesting career. He's written several books. Before he came to the DNA, he's been a lecturer in history. He did a PhD at Cambridge. And he's been in the UK Parliament as the MP from Stoke-on-Trent, which interestingly is well known for pottery. And I think a lot of our Bombay pottery might have gone there or may have been inspired by the pottery that came from there. So there's a kind of cultural, artistic connection as well. And Tristram has also been Secretary of State for Education, which is no museums really. I believe and think that museums are fundamentally educational institutions. So welcome, Tristram, and welcome to Mumbai, welcome to the museum. We look forward to your lecture.
Thank you so much for giving me this, Jane. It's a great pleasure to be in your wonderful city and to be in your wonderful museum, which was a Victorian Albert Museum before the museum I represent was a Victorian Albert Museum. Indeed, yours was going to be called the Victoria Museum, ours was going to be called the Albert Museum, and both of them ended up for a while as Victoria and Albert. So it's a great privilege to be with you. What I thought I'd do this evening is talk about some of the prehistory of the Victorian Albert Museum in the UK, explore what we now do at the museum, look at some of the collection, and then set out some of the challenges which we're facing in the museum world in the UK today, whilst also reflecting on the relationship here to the Bhau Daji Lad and what happens here. So let me begin with the collections we have. The V&A is what we regard as the world's leading museum of art, design and performance. And each year we welcome over 4 million visitors across our two sites, one in South Kensington, where the main museum is, and the other, the Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green. Founded, as we'll see, in 1852 to raise the standard of British design and make works of art available to all. Today, our purpose is to champion creative industry, inspire the next generation, and spark everyone's imagination. The title of this talk is Ingenuity and Imagination. And when we think about the kind of purpose and function of our museum and try and drill down into it, it's really about displaying great works of ingenuity of the past and then inspiring the imagination of future designers and creatives and professionals. We hold around 2.3 million objects in our collections, and then everyone always says, well, haven't you got more on display? Around 100,000 of them are displayable items, and we have around 60,000 on display at any one time in the museum, which we then revolve. With our pioneering research culture, deep curatorial expertise, and groundbreaking exhibitions, what we like to do is illuminate the story of the making and the made. But we're also a living, breathing space. And last year we sold 105,115 scones. If you like scones, if you want to eat scones, the V&A is the place to come for scones. We also have our own beehives. We produce rather sweet honey, because the bees like going to the gardens of the Chinese ambassador, who has lychees in his garden. And so the honey we produce is quite sweet. And then we also do yoga. The third most searched term on the V&A website is V&A yoga. And here we see yoga taking place beneath the Raphael cartoons in the Raphael court. And As Mrs. Mehta said, earlier this year in February, I was privileged enough to be appointed director of the Victorian and Albert Museum, having previously been the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central. And some obviously asked how, as a former Member of Parliament, I could possibly have the skills for working in a vast Victorian edifice surrounded by gnarled historical artefacts. But I somehow have muddled through. But it was interesting actually thinking about the difference between Parliament and the museums. And in a sense, despite now being the director of a collection focused on thousands of years of history, actually I find museums much more interested in the future than the past, and much more focused on modernity than some of the kind of nostalgia and historicism which was always present in Parliament. So I feel much more sort of urgent today than I did when I was there in Westminster. But what I did learn from Westminster, and what I did learn as a politician, is the importance of an immediate and close relationship to the public. And as Westminster Members of Parliament, every Friday afternoon you are in your constituency with members of the public coming to talk to you about housing or tax or transport or how terrible their neighbours are. And that sense of service and focus and interaction with the public stayed with me, and I think it's very, very important museums also have that sense of immediacy to the publics which they're privileged to serve. So, the foundations of the V&A. Those of you who know the V&A will reflect on its kind of rather disparate collections, and it's always been argued that it had no kind of sort of founding purpose. It was described, even at its foundation, as a refuge for destitute collections. One of my previous directors, Sir Roy Strong, called it an extremely capacious handbag, and others have called it the nation's attic. But there were strategic foundations to it, and I'd like to touch on three of them to begin with. And the first and the foundation element of it is the East India Company, is the South Asian Collection. The East India Company began collecting really as a part of the kind of psychology of empire in the 1780s and 1790s. And in 1799, the East India Company Repository, which later became the India Museum, was established. And this was one of the essential elements of the V&A. The three fields of collection which Warren Hastings specified in his plan were a cabinet of natural productions, artificial productions, and miscellaneous articles. And the collection grew during the course of the 19th century. And so we are privileged to have an extraordinary, superb textiles and fabric collection at the V&A. But the highlight of our South Asian collection is the celebrated man-tiger organ, which is a remarkable and rather interesting addition to the collection. So this was Tipu Sultan's tiger organ, and famously Tipu Sultan said he would rather live 2 days like a tiger than 200 years like a sheep. And it's a wind-up organ, and as you wind it up, you hear the growls of the tiger and the screams of the soldier whose neck is being ripped apart by the tiger. And this was, interestingly enough, designed by a French engineer for an Indian prince depicting the decapitation of a British officer. So it's the story, in a sense, of the late 18th century. And why this is important as well is this really begins the kind of popular interest in South Asian collection in Britain. And the storming of Seringapatam and the extraction of Tipu Sultan's riches, some of which come to the V&A, some of which go on the open market, really kind of opens up for the British public imagination the full riches of the story of India in the early 1800s. I think what's also interesting, though, is that it showed what a collector Tipu Sultan himself was, that actually the riches he had in his own collection were brought from around the world as well. So the first section, East India Company Repository. The second is something I'm particularly passionate about, which is the focus on design schools. So in the 1840s, there was a real concern that Britain was beginning to lose its competitive edge against French, German, and American competition. And this is after the period of the First Industrial Revolution and before the Second Industrial Revolution. And so increasingly government focused on the need to teach design, that if we were going to create the products of the future, we needed to really focus on design education. The principles of design should form a portion of any permanent system of national education, was the report of one select committee. And across the country, you began to see schools of design emerge. And so this one is the Wedgwood Institute in Burslem, in Stoke-on-Trent, and this is where Lockwood Kipling, who would then go on to be the JJ School of Art, the Professor of Art here in Bombay, Mumbai, this is where he first taught, before actually he then came to South Kensington, to the V&A, and then came to Bombay. And the reason Lockwood Kipling's son, Rudyard, is called Rudyard is because just north of Stoke, there's this beauty spot called Rudyard Lake, which Lockwood and Alice Kipling always enjoyed walking around. And so when they had their son, they named him after that. So at the heart of this sort of collection of schools of design was going to sit the V&A, as it was then the South Kensington Museum. It began as a school of design, teaching design. And this is very important for the DNA of our institution, that we were never a fine art gallery. We were never a place of retreat from the world. We were always about inspiring creativity, about teaching, about being engaged with enterprise and wealth creation and innovation. And so our collections were meant to draw upon that vision. And the person who had a great idea of that was, of course, Prince Albert. Albert, despite being the Prince Consort, was a radical reforming figure. He didn't like the landed English aristocracy and their kind of laziness and arrogance and hubris. And he thought the British economy was also falling behind. He could see what was happening in his native Saxony and in Germany. And so he wanted to bring these principles of design and innovation to London. And actually he created around him a circle of rather interesting radical figures, not least this individual Gottfried Semper, who was an architect. And he always described museums as the true institutions of a free people. That museums also had this civic function, that if you are going to see the growth of democracy during the course of the 19th century, if you're going to teach your future masters, as it were, museums had this civic function embedded within them. And reflecting today on the Bhau Daji Lad Museum and its origins, you see so many of these themes apparent about the focus right from the mid-1850s on design and technology, the focus on wealth creation, the focus on manufacturing, the need to create a collection which would then inspire those who saw it to think about design and creativity into the future. And so through the cases here, whether it's the brass work, whether it's the pottery, and I can confirm that the The beautiful Minton tiles were made in my former constituency. The Herbert Minton's factory stood on London Road in Stoke-on-Trent, and it made the tiles for the Royal Bombay Yacht Club. It made the tiles for the Houses of Parliament, and it made the tiles for the Victorian Albert Museum. I now have to report to you that it is a Sainsbury's supermarket, but as most things in Britain are. But the ideals, in a sense, were the same, and the spirit behind it that Bartle Frere had of liberating wealth creation, of spurring innovation and manufacturing here in Bombay. Frere's vision, and whether it was the pulling down of the fort or whether it was the creation of the museum, was this vision of Bombay as an industrial, manufacturing, wealth-creating city. In the British imagination, Bombay was always Manchester and Birmingham. This was a place of energy and function and modernity and wealth creation. And museums were not places of retreat within that. Museums were not fine art galleries. Museums were how to create craft and innovation and design. Back in Britain, the man who was going to deliver this was our first director. And Prince Albert only had one joke, and he said, if you need steam, get coal. And this is how directors of the V&A should look, by the way. So this is our founding director, Henry Cole. Henry Cole was one of those extraordinary Victorian figures who invents the postcard, who creates the whole modern idea of Christmas, who establishes the V&A, who, as we see, creates the Great Exhibition. He had relentless energy, and he was an institution builder, and he was a creative figure. Cole wanted Cole wanted an institution which would sort of embody these ideas of design and manufacturing and innovation. And he got his architects, as we'll see, to build the South Kensington Museum as it was first established. And the reason I love these pictures is that on the left we have Henry Cole directing his three men, telling them what to do to build him a museum. And on the right we have an entirely female team of architects, engineers and designers who built our new addition to the museum recently. But Cole's vision was based on the Great Exhibition. So throughout the 1840s and 50s, you have these series of exhibitions which are really, on the one hand, sort of testimonies to the industrial and manufacturing might of Western European nations. There are also kind of depictions of colonial power at the same time. But what the Great Exhibition produced was really a sense, not of the sort of might of Britain as the workshop of the world, as this enormous sort of unrelenting force in modern power, but actually a sense of fragility about where British imperial might was. Because yes, the British products there on show were impressive, but suddenly they saw what the French and the Germans and the Americans were producing, and were fearful about the future. So that kind of design school impulse, the Great Exhibition, all of this is leading up to the establishment of the South Kensington Museum. And we, if you look, for example, at the original catalogue of the Great Exhibition of 1851, so the focus on raw materials, machinery, manufacturing, fine art, colonies, foreign states, we thought it might be an interesting kind of thought experiment to think if we did catalogues today. And so our contemporary Great Exhibition has come up with artificial intelligence, climate change, hacking, robots, social design, activism, art. And if we did have a Great Exhibition, I think those would be some of the themes that we might look at. So out of these forces, the India Museum the design school movement, the Great Exhibition, the patronage of Prince Albert, comes the establishment of what is first known as the South Kensington Museum. It is built on land just south of Kensington Palace, open land, which with the profits from the Great Exhibition, Prince Albert is able, the trustees of the future trustees of the South Kensington Museum are able to buy up these plots of land. And what Prince Albert wanted to create was what was called Albertopolis. It was this place where you had the South Kensington Museum, you had Imperial College, you had the Royal Albert Hall, you had the Royal College of Music, you would have in time the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum. So this was a cultural quarter, we'd call it today, or a campus focused on design and innovation and learning at the cutting edge, all of those areas that are cutting edge. And the role of the South Kensington Museum within this, which had previously had collections around manufacturing, around South Asia, was to provide this storehouse of innovation and learning for future designers and creators. And so it's built in this glorious Italianate style. I don't think this would look out of place in Mumbai, in parts of Mumbai today. But at the heart of it was also a deep commitment to public access. So we, right from the beginning, have a cafe. So that if you come to the Victorian Albert Museum as a working man or woman, this isn't some painful experience of going to a museum. Actually, it is an enjoyable moment where you can have refreshments. We like people. Some people are snooty about cafes and museums. We've had them right from the beginning. We like people eating scones and having cups of tea. And indeed, we liked it so much that we had William Morris design one of the rooms for refreshment. And then we like people shopping in our museums. People say shops and museums are new and they're terrible. The rest of it. No, right from the beginning. We like people coming here and coming to the V&A and spending money in shops. And this is our new shop, and that was the bank holiday at the Bethnal Green Museum. And what we put in our shops are some of the products of designers and craftspeople and makers. So actually at the core of the institution, at the core of the museum, we're also providing a space and a launch pad for designers and innovators today. One of the more interesting first galleries of the V&A was called the Chamber of Horrors, because what the museum was also there to do was to teach a growing urban citizenry the principles of good taste. That they now had a disposable income, they were going to buy material goods, and it was the role of curators and museum directors to tell people what is good and bad taste. And this convolvulus gas jet made in Birmingham in 1848 was part of the Chamber of Horrors. And the original caption said, "Gas flaming from the petal of a convolvulus, one of a class of ornaments very popular, but entirely indefensible in principle." So this was what not to buy. And we've kept that up today. In the V&A, in today's V&A museum, you will find a Hello Kitty rice cooker. Actually very popular in our Japanese gallery. Katy Perry false eyelashes, and even I don't know why we have a Wolf Lusig soft toy from IKEA in the collection. But what really transformed the reputation of what was still the South Kensington Museum, it only becomes the Victorian Albert Museum in 1899 when we become the Victorian Albert Museum and the Science Museum becomes the Science Museum. We split at that point. At that point, the South Kensington Museum is still this richer connection of science and industry and technology. No conception of a divide, a kind of C.P. Snow two cultures divide between science and art then. The South Kensington Museum kept it together as one. But what really escalates the reputation of the South Kensington Museum is the arrival of the Raphael cartoons. The Raphael cartoons are a stunning piece in the grand manner of work by Raphael. And these were the template for the tapestries which then hang in the Vatican. And made in the early 1500s, then used for a good 100 years for other tapestries. They then come to Britain in the 1630s. King Charles I buys them because he wants to set up his own tapestry at Mortlake, his own factory at Mortlake, and they would model them on the Raphaels. Then Oliver Cromwell was going to happen, and they stay in the royal family, and then Queen Victoria, on Albert, in memory of Albert, gifts them on long loan, which we hope to keep, to the V&A in the 1860s, and they really elevate the kind of reputation and power and significance of the museum. Really. Today, if you sort of think of, what is the greatest, or certainly arguably it's controversial as well, jewel in the British Museum system, it might be the Elgin marbles, it might be the Rosetta Stone, it might be some elements of the British Museum. In the 19th century, it was the Raphael cartoons. This was the pinnacle of art and culture in the UK, and they sat in the South Kensington Museum, and we were delighted they did so. And then the collection begins to grow. And when you, as ever with the museum, when you read through the history of it, the combination of the kind of personal predilections of curators, of directors, of great philanthropists, of donors, how it emerges, and design always is at the core of it. Design is at the core of it. How does this help to teach design? So whether it's the fashion collection, whether it's Rodin's sculptures, whether it's the silverware, the jewellery, whether it's the ceramics, row upon row of ceramics. We do very well, particularly in Persia, in Iran, in the 1870s, 1880s, because we have a buyer there who works for the British-Persian telegraph system. So as he's putting the telegraph through Iran, he's going into the villages, he's going into some of the mosques, and he's buying up remarkable pottery, which is then coming back to Britain. And what we also did was buy photography. We were one of the first museums in the world to begin collecting photography. And again, Henry Cole thought of that. So brilliant. Which takes me to the kind of next point, which is that we had great permanent galleries. But right from the start, the Victoria and Albert Museum was also about special exhibitions. And again, we have this sort of commentary in recent years that there are too many special exhibitions in museums. We're kind of enthralled to the cycle of exhibitions. Well, we began exhibitions in 1862 with our first exhibition was the wedding list of the Prince and Princess of Wales. So you don't get more down market than that. And it was a great success. But this was the first display of our photography, and we continue to hold special exhibitions bringing to life our collection. Our most successful exhibition ever was in 1946, after the war, Britain Can Make It. And it was meant to be this celebration of what Britain could do after the war. I'm coming under some pressure, I have to tell you, to produce for March 2019, for the dreaded Brexit date, another exhibition of Britain Can Make It. We might have to call it sort of Britain Has to Make It. Can Britain make it? I don't know. Our exhibition schedule today is very, very diverse. So on the one hand, the big exhibition of recent of this year was the Pink Floyd exhibition. Pink Floyd, Their Mortal Remains, and this was putting Pink Floyd, an incredibly important British rock group, within the idiom of British culture, and actually they drew on all sorts of elements of the English pastoral tradition. And because because the Theatre Museum is part of the Victorian Albert Museum as well, performance is a big part of what we do. Our David Bowie exhibition, for example, has now been seen by 1.8 million people around the world, and we do these kind of big immersive exhibitions incredibly well. But at the same time, it's very important that we have the kind of detailed, precise, really scholarly in a different way exhibition, such as we did Opus Anglicanum on English medieval embroidery, which was a very beautiful account of this moment of real achievement, of global achievement in medieval embroidery. Coming up, our new exhibitions with Winnie the Pooh and the story of the kind of design around that. A great exhibition opening up on ocean liners, speed and style, the story of the Art Deco modernism design in the ocean liners, 1850 to 1960. Fashion from Nature is the story of how fashion has been inspired by the natural world and nature, but then also its impact today on the natural world and ecology. The Future Starts Here is about how design is coping and challenging and changing future trends. Frida Kahlo's wardrobe, in conjunction with the Blue House in Mexico City, is taking Frida Kahlo's wardrobe, analysing it in terms of her visual arts, but also exploring themes of ethnicity and disability through the wardrobe, through the corsets, through her story there. It's going to be a very powerful exhibition, that. And finally, video games. This is going to be an interesting one, where we put video games within a craft context. And actually, if you think today of the exhibitions in the Bhau Daji Lad or our own museums about what we're collecting today, actually there's a craftsmanship around video games today, which is an updated account of many of some of the previous idioms we have worked in. We're very lucky that we now have a new gallery to display many of these exhibitions in, and just let me very briefly talk you through our new Exhibition Road quarter, where we cut out a huge hole and dug 50 metres deep down just on the side of Exhibition Road next to the museum. And what's amazing is the piling down, and not a single artefact was broken during the course of all this construction. And then we've built this kind of cat's cradle, which you see, underneath which we have a new exhibition gallery, which is on the top right. The top left is now the courtyard. And I'm very passionate about this because it's a new civic space. It's a new open civic space. And it really goes back, I think, to the Albertopolis idea of this open kind of civic piazza. And we bleed out now into Exhibition Road. So we share a space and I think an identity with our colleagues on Exhibition Road. And now when you come into the museum here, the first galleries you see are the Ho galleries of Buddhist art. So the first artifacts you see in the Victorian Albert Museum today, if you come in on this entrance, is non-Western art from South Asia and Southeast Asia. And I think you can see it's an absolutely fabulous space now. This is a porcelain tile courtyard. This is the world's first porcelain tile courtyard. I tried to get them made in Stoke, but I was too late. Actually, they're made in Holland. And what it does is bring to life both the Henry Cole wing on the left, if you remember that early picture of the architects there, and the Aston Webb element on the right, which is a later 19th century one. And as soon as we opened it, 40% of visitors started coming in this new entrance compared to the old. At the same time, we've been working away in Scotland on a new museum there, which is called V&A Dundee, but we're actually we're involved in a consortium in Dundee, creating a new museum of Scottish design. So this is the first museum of Scottish design to be built right on the River Tay. And if Birmingham was Bombay, then Dundee was Calcutta. And so the jute routes, the trade routes to Calcutta, the huge jute mills you still see in it. And this has had a very sort of already very tangible effect on regeneration and growth in Dundee. And all being well, this will open in late summer next year. And you can see, what I love is it juts right out into the Tay. Kengo Kuma, a Japanese architect, designed it, and we're very excited by that. Similarly, we have some new galleries, just on a limited period in China, in Shekou, Shenzhen. We think that China at the moment is in that moment from made in China to designed in China. And in the Pearl River Delta, you have this extraordinary confluence of design and manufacturing. And just as we came into being in the 1840s, in that moment, that aftermath of the first industrial revolution before the second, we think China in many ways is in a not dissimilar place. So it seems almost natural for the V&A to be there. Let me now just, in my final section, just think about some of the challenges that we're thinking about in the museum world. And the first is about restoration and preservation and new technology. I said we were very passionate about having working people into museums from the beginning of this museum. And so at the heart of the Victorian Albert Museum is something called the cast courts, which are plaster cast replications of some of the great works of European art. So whether it's Michelangelo's David, whether it's Brunelleschi's doors, whether it's Pisano's pulpit, these are plaster cast copies, so that working people didn't have to go to Pisa or Rome or to Florence. They could come to London and see it for themselves. But we also know that huge numbers of great works of art and great historical artifacts are now under pressure of destruction. On the right here, you see on the one side the kind of mini mushroom cloud of Palmyra, of the ancient site of Palmyra, being blown up by ISIS. And on the right, you see one of our plaster cast copies of a bust that was destroyed in World War II, and one half is now in Berlin, and the other half is in St. Petersburg, and we have the only 3D version, but it's a plaster cast. Similarly, here is a stone detail from a church in Herefordshire, and the original is on the left, which stands in the church, subject to wind and rain and deterioration, and on the right is our plaster cast. And in many cases now, if you want to study the original or something, the plaster cast is a more valuable account. In the world today of digital reproductions, of 3D printing, of drone scanning, we're entering this whole new world of thinking about reproductions and the nature of reproductions. If you see the excellent India in the World exhibition at the CSMVS, there are there are 3 reproductions within that, which are labelled as reproductions. And then you begin to have this very interesting debate about whether you lose the aura and the magnificence of the original. Here on the left is a facsimile, a digital reproduction of Veronese's wedding feast at Cana, which hangs in the Louvre. The wedding feast was ripped down from the walls of the San Giorgio refectory in Venice when the Napoleonic troops invaded Venice. They rip it down, they take it to Paris. After Napoleon's fall, the citizens of Venice say, can we have Veronese back now, please. And the director of the Louvre says, oh, no, it's far too fragile to travel. And it hangs there. And the question is, with the kind of scene around it, is the digital facsimile a true representation? Is it less or worse? Does it not have the aura of the original? But look for a moment where the digital facsimile hangs. The digital facsimile now hangs in the refectory where the original was meant to be. So the question today is, in a sense, where does the aura lie? Does it lie with our tour gang in the Louvre? Meanwhile, everyone, by the way, is looking the other way at the Mona Lisa. No one's actually, very few are looking at the wedding at Cana. Or does it lie where it was originally conceived for in terms of its place in Venice? And I think as we get into a situation whereby more and more reproductions will be available, you'll be able to download, you'll be able to 3D print your own. What are some of the ethical principles around mass reproduction in a digital age? And at the same time, if we can just reproduce things, does it mean we're no longer so interested in conservation? Who holds the data? These are all, I think, very interesting questions that we're wrestling with. Secondly, I think this is a more particularly British challenge at the moment, which is that national museums, quite rightly, are under great stress to lend and loan their objects, to make sure as many people have access to them as possible. And we at the V&A are the largest lender in the country, because whilst national museums in the UK are doing well, regional museums, particularly local authority, council museums, are under a great deal of pressure and need the support of national museums. And this has become even more apparent with Brexit, and the sense that London, part of the kind of drumbeat towards Brexit, was a sense that London and the cultural institutions in London were detached from the mainstream of British society. And were not supporting cultural and social capital in coastal communities, in coalfield communities, in non-metropolitan communities. And if you look at the data of where the Leave vote is in red and the Remain vote is in blue, and so Scotland, Northern Ireland of the United Kingdom vote to Remain, just a bit of Wales, most of Wales votes to Leave, and it's mainly the metropolitan areas which vote to remain in the European Union, and that's London, it's Bristol, it's Exeter, it's Manchester, it's Liverpool, and so this kind of cultural fissure that we have in the UK at the moment, museums have a role, it seems to me, in helping to bridge that. And what we're doing at the V&A, our response to this, is really to think about education, to go back to our roots and focus on education. Some of those parts of the country which voted to leave the European Union have really challenging educational results. And it seems to me that as a national museum, we have a responsibility to reach out to them. Something we're also alert to and focused on is our colonial inheritance and our colonial legacy. And my view, in a sense, is taking a kind of autopsy approach to this, that everything should be on the table, and we should look at the history and the nature of the collections and how they came into being and how we think about them. And so whether it was the storming of Seringapatam, from which we gained Tipu's tiger, or the golden throne of Rajat Singh, which is now actually on tour in Coventry, and the Sikh community in the West Midlands are really excited by their access to it. Similarly, if we look at our collections from the storming of the Summer Palace, it gets more complicated actually once you begin to unpick some of this, because not everything which will have, as it were, the provenance of the Summer Palace, actually comes from that moment. The history, when you unpick the history of these collections and then their circulation and how they come into museum collections, it becomes more challenging but also more interesting. And my view is that we should have true and proper historical accounts of all that. And similarly, our Ethiopian collection, gained from the Magdala raid in 1868, and some elements of these are in the British Museum, the British Library, and the Victorian Albert Museum. And the challenge from the Ethiopian community in London at the moment is not a conversation about restitution, it's a conversation about why aren't you doing more with them. The Ethiopian ambassador quite rightly says, well, you know, they're dispersed across the museum, there isn't the right level of interpretation or conversation around them, you know, let's have and so we're doing that next year on the anniversary of the raid. Finally, amidst all the issues about education and loans and legacies, we are also a place of beauty. And if not a place of retreat, a place of inspiration and ingenuity. And we were talking yesterday about, at the Tata Literary Festival, about digital technology and digital in the museum. And we're all in favour of more digital engagement because actually that brings people in. And when they come in and they stand in front of the Three Graces or the Beckett casket and see it for themselves, the power and the wonder of human achievement comes through. As I recounted yesterday, famously in the thought experiment, which said to a focus group, or they said to a poll, you know, the Mona Lisa had burnt down. You can see either a totally perfect digital reproduction of it, or you can go and look at the ashes of Mona Lisa. And 80% opt for the ashes of Mona Lisa rather than seeing the digital image. And our inspiration for this is one of our founding figures, William Morris, a great socialist, a great author, a great designer, who ultimately believed in the power of beauty and the democracy of beauty. And part of the story and purpose and meaning of my institution and institutions here in Mumbai, led by Mrs. Mehta at the Bhau Daji Lad, is to have that sense of beauty and wonder which people can be inspired by, but also just wonder at. So come and visit. Thank you.
Other questions? Please introduce yourself.
Robbie Zell. Partly from what I gathered yesterday as well as today, if one brings together the issue of digitalisation and design, to what extent are you able, or might you be planning, to use the textile collection and have an interactive design tool so that people can actually use it as a basis for their own creations? And I would divide this into two areas. One would be for actual live designers, say in the fashion textile industry, and secondly for children. I did actually see briefly on your website you had some workshop for children, but does this exist? Will it exist? Can I use it tomorrow?
This is a terrifying moment where the director doesn't know quite what's on the website. But I think having the interactive element in the digital is very, very important. But I think the challenge comes with thinking about what we can do best with our resources and what actually third parties, be they businesses or enterprises or charities, can do. And our role seems to be to provide the data and the access and the support, which actually others might be able to manage and manipulate more effectively. So I think, you know, we have, for example, we have some really good digital sessions on Minecraft and the V&A. So you could rebuild the V&A in Minecraft and create a whole Minecraft game around the V&A, which looked at some of the collections and the digital components. So very enthusiastic in principle. You've got me in that I don't know quite how far we've got with this, but I also think we shouldn't be too protective about other people taking our data, taking our imagery, and accessing it and doing something else with it. Because if that brings more people to us as a publicly funded museum, then that's a good thing.
I'm interested to know a little bit about your leadership style. I'm a law fellow, so I met Martin Roth, and I'm just interested because the V&A is obviously, you know, will go differently now, and if you could just share some of your thinking on leadership.
I think first of all, before I was a member of Parliament, I was a historian. I was a historian of the mid 19th century, when many of these galleries were established in Bombay, in London, in Birmingham, in Berlin, and so having a sense of the history of these institutions is important. And I think many of our institutions became overly protective of their of the academic castle in the mid to late 20th century, when the needs of the public were often put secondary to public access. I mean, having said that, they were already complaining in the 1830s about the British Museum not being very welcoming. So it's not a wholly new thing. But we also had at the V&A this other history of popular exhibitions, of sort of the democracy of learning, of accessibility, which speaks very powerfully, and then also just a focus on education and practically. So what we're doing is we are working, beginning now in Coventry and in Blackburn in the northwest, a former textiles city, working with 11 to 16-year-olds with their local museums and coalitions of schools to teach the new GCSE, the new school exam in design and technology. So we're getting our hands dirty, and the curators are going out there, and our objects are going out there, and they're coming to us, and then we're doing professional development for the teachers. And so it's quite a practical approach to this. And this is our first year, so some things are going to go right and some things are going to go wrong, and this is a kind of pilot session. But I think in terms of the leadership, having a clear sense of the foundational purpose of the institution, and then thinking about its relevance in modern Britain, is hopefully what I'm hoping to achieve.
So, Tristram, I wanted to ask you that given that you hold these collections from so many different parts of the world, from different parts of empire, how much space and time, in terms of exhibition time and space, do you devote to developing a relationship? It's a loaded question, I would say right from the beginning. How much time and space do you devote to relationships with these former countries and perhaps institutions from where the objects have come, or you have relations? It seems to me that it's a very the focus is very much on your local audience or British audience, and you travel exhibitions, but do you bring in exhibitions from other parts of the world in a collaborative way, in a sense.
Yes, I mean, very much so. I mean, our leading textile, one of our leading textile curators, a brilliant young woman called Evelyn Fotheringham, has spent the last 2 weeks in Kolkata working with colleagues there. We have learned so much from the conservation work in Kolkata in our textile department. We've had a team working with us, so that kind of partnership of really rich curatorial and conservation knowledge is absolutely right. We've worked with you, and we're delighted to have done that in the past on photography, on posters. We've worked with Mr. Mukherjee on landscapes and painting, and I was shocked when he told me today the full extent of our collection of Bollywood posters, which I tell you, I'm going right back to South Kensington and demanding knowledge there. So there has to be, you're absolutely right, there has to be a kind of a rich partnership around this. I look forward to those conversations and connections in the future. What I think we need, though, is kind of, whether it's exhibitions or conservation or research, you need sort of practical programs which bring the parties together, and a nice big research grant from a benevolent institution. That's the ideal marriage.
I'm Hugo Bayer. It's a little bit in the same direction. We've received generous sponsorships and donations in the past to create great galleries, particularly the Japanese gallery was one of the first, Islamic, the Chinese. But it also creates the potential of an injustice in a sense of unbalance. The Indian galleries is not as fancy. How do you deal with these issues, or try to rectify in the future?
That is in the hands of people who know people in this room. I'm very keen to, the South Asia galleries are 25 years old. We need to redo the cases, we need to redo the lighting. It is up to me as a director to try and seek those partnerships and sponsorships to change that. And and there are moments when, benevolent individuals come round our museum and say, well, why is the Japanese gallery so fantastic, and why is, I must do something. And we say, yes, you must do something, and this is the way to do it. But we will always, we have an obligation to always preserve and protect and present as best we can our collections. And we also have a long list of things we want to do. But I think your point is right, though, about ensuring the permanent galleries and the permanent collection is presented as effectively as possible. I mean, actually, the need now is in our fashion galleries, where we're getting to the situation where we can't borrow items because, as it were, the levels of our conservation in some of those cases aren't good enough. And if you've hit that point, then you're in, many of you know, then you're in real trouble as a museum. So you're absolutely right to draw me up on it, and I look forward to working together on a solution.
Hi, thanks a lot for this very perspicacious talk. My name is Abhay Sarvesai. I edit Art India magazine, and this is a kind of a ride, kind of a corollary to what Tasneem just said. Just wondering about, the fate and destiny of the museum as a social political installation. And an institutional initiative which has a hoary and a very loaded colonial past. So I'm just wondering, and this is a question, I guess, which is equally sort of aimed at both you and Tasneem, if I may ask her to also respond to this. How much of a certain collective guilt. How much of it and how much of that substance, which guilt is composed of, becomes a kind of an engine to drive or to become more self-conscious about your status as an important point of anchorage as far as the larger sort of civilizational ethos of London, of England, as a space vis-a-vis all the other nations in the United States?
I think it's a very powerful question. I would say our history as an institution is both colonial and non-colonial. So our history as an institution is British, as I hope I showed, is British, is European, and is non-European. And so there are multiple components to it, and that's part of the wonder of it. Is in a sense that interaction. My view is that you can't avoid this, and what you need is as rich an account of it as possible. And I think what's interesting about Tipu's Tiger is that this is a story of multiple collecting. That within Tipu Sultan's collection was also a story of kind of European influence, of European collections coming to India. In a sense, Tipu's Tiger is as much a French construct as it is a Indian construct. What it is actually is that moment of French, British, and Indian sort of meeting in the late 18th century. But similarly, Veronese's Wedding at Cana is a Venetian product in a French gallery, which in the 1810s they were told they weren't going to get back. My view is you cannot understand London, without Delhi or Bombay, and you certainly cannot understand the V&A without Delhi or Bombay or Tehran or any number of other places. So I think I'm maybe this is me, that it's not really maybe it's my background as a historian. It's not so much the guilt as a historian's interest in having it all on the table, the autopsy approach. What I think has also shifted is the nature of diaspora politics. And so the Sikh community, in some senses, the Sikh community in the West Midlands, which is vast, seeing Ranjit Singh's throne is very, very powerful for them. And we're seeing more and more and larger diaspora communities in different urban areas. And so the responsibility of the V&A, for example, to the Ethiopian diaspora community in London seems to me to make sure that we are exploring and explaining and exposing that history as effectively as possible. So it's that kind of not shying away from the history, but also not sort of tying ourselves too much up in knots that we can't actually explore and explain the artifacts. At the same time, we take seriously, any claims for restitution and any legal obligations we have.
So, I think we answer that question a bit through our contemporary art program. I mean, there isn't really a guilt, but there is, this whole to deconstruct that whole history. And what we did through the restoration was to sort of, in fact, recreate what was there before. It's something that is lost in the DNA. What you see here is probably what an early version of the DNA looked like. And of course, we've used the same taxonomies, the same ideas. We've retrofitted everything and made it more modern. But then you invite these artists, these thinking artists, that we know the relationship with the Jeta School of Art. So it primarily, originally focused on the Jeta School of Art artists, and we invited them to interrogate the collection and to interrogate this history and make, we have Sudarshan, we have Rina sitting here, who've done amazing exhibitions here that have interrogated that history and brought out important issues of concern without being didactic or without sort of hitting you on the head and saying this is the way it is, or being unpleasant about it, but encouraging you to contemplate and to think. There are so many nuances to this history, and so to explore those nuances. So I don't see, for us at least, any sense of guilt, but I do think we do need, it is a troubled history, and I do think we need to address it.
Well, I'm Caroline. Well, very much on the same note, I wanted to ask you, making exhibitions on colonialism or related to colonialism in London today, post-Brexit also, and with a large South Asian diaspora also in London, in Britain, how you kind of bridge between different audiences in England, in Britain today, well, very much in the light of Brexit.
It's a biggie. The big problem is a very boring problem, which is that as the Tate Gallery showed with its exhibition Artist and Empire, it's very hard to get the numbers you need for exhibitions on, as it were, history, and then colonial history, and then the decorative arts of colonial history is very, very hard. And I have to balance my books and have exhibitions people are going to be drawn to. We can do more and more displays, we can make different interventions, we can, and we do that. I think your broader kind of philosophical point about the nature of the museum, and we were debating this with fellow museum directors in Mumbai late last week, is the notion of hospitality, in a sense, that the museum is this secular civic space in which we invite kind of everyone and have their and everyone's views and norms and approaches are equally valid. And so the museum almost is a kind of neutral space within that. Or does the museum inherently and necessarily have certain power relationships, which means that it is putting forward a more didactic view? And then is the museum involved in creating citizens? Are we, to go back to Gottfried Semper, the true teachers of a free people, and have that function? And do people want to be sort of taught in that way in museums? And I think it's probably inevitably a bit of both. The reason you take your children to museums is not because you regard their views necessarily, maybe I'm just a reactionary father, but necessarily as of equal worth as actually you want to teach them about. And you are relying on curatorial skill and insight to present a narrative and an account which, because of the nature of the institution, you regard or value. And that's why I go to the British Museum to teach them about, Egyptians. But at the same time, we obviously necessarily have, in today's multicultural, multi-ethnic society, and not least because of the nature of our collections, I think a far more subtle and sophisticated approach to how we're creating those narratives. So I don't believe, I believe in the value and function of the curator. I believe curators are people of skill and intelligence and learning, and they're there through hard work and great understanding. And their view, and the reason you're going to a museum is because you are taking a view that they have put the object and the power of the object in a certain manner. And that is probably a bit kind of 1848, but I quite like 1848 in some ways. It was a revolutionary moment. That might be good.
So, if there aren't any more questions, then we can bring the meeting to a close. And thank you, Tristram. That was a tour de force. And really, it was wonderful to go through that early history with you. And thank you, all of you, for being with us this evening. And, please continue to come to our programs and to support us. Your presence is very important. Thank you. And this is a small gift from us, but Tristram.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.